Put this banana on. Got my banana going.
Got my banana.
It's pretty fun of them to call it that. All right, we're going to try again, huh? Okay, I'm going to hit the record button then.
Do it. Clap.
No, you weren't supposed to say it. Oh, my God.
Beep, 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 beep. Joe Rogan.
What am I dealing with?
I don't know. Oh, man. I'm Ryan.
I'm Harland, and this is the Dawdler's Philosophy Podcast. Episode Dose.
Let us cast this pod. What is a pod? Never mind. Yeah, this is a continuation of everything for all zero members out there. Today, we're going to talk about, I guess it's what got it all started. I don't even know what it is we're talking about, but I'm going to talk about how things get started here. There was a metaphor used in a paper about evolutionary biology. And this particular metaphor is an architectural metaphor. And the authors used the word spandrels for this metaphor. The paper is called The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the Adaptationist program. And it's by Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin. And Gould was a paleontologist at Harvard University, and Lewontin was a population geneticist at Harvard University. And I guess they weren't too far away from each other in the building where they had their offices, and so I guess they were somewhat chummy. And Lewontin in his own right was quite influential, especially with respect to, and I'm going to make this little the dichotomy. He was a very influential neontologist, if Gould is a paleontologist. So, and this paper in particular was super influential within the field of evolutionary biology. And essentially, like it says, it's a critique of the adaptationist program. And adaptationism is defined by them in a couple different ways, but the one that I kind of like the most is sort of the kind of in brief definition, which is essentially something along the lines of, atomization plus optimizing selection on parts. So the idea is you have an organism and you take them apart into their basic, whatever it is that's sticking out to you regarding features that organisms possess, for instance. And the idea that adaptation is trying to optimize them through natural selection towards some kind of state that matches the environmental conditions, as best as they can. So that's their sense for what the adaptationist program is. And, it drew the ire of many in the field, but it also kind of scared a lot of people because their critique, in my opinion, was quite extensive, So they start off the paper with a whole bunch of really interesting metaphors. They do something that I think is really effective when it comes to try and talk about biological systems. They use anthropogenic systems. So kind of like Darwin used artificial selection to kind of talk about ultimately natural selection. They're using these architectural, structural metaphors and analogies to try and talk about organisms and sort of the byproducts that can occur in both, and sort of what role those have to play in evolution. And so again, it was kind of a frustrating thing, I think, for a lot of people in evolutionary biology at the time, because it was calling out maybe some problems that, a lot of evolutionists at the time were, exhibiting, in their work. And so it's been years and years. It was published in 1979. It's been a long enough time now that it's not really something that makes the rounds on a regular basis in at least discussions of evolutionary biology. It's certainly within evolutionary biology does, but it doesn't make it into the mainstream all that much. It's not like there's like tons of videos on YouTube about spandrels or the metaphor that they were using. And so I happened upon there's I kind of have to get into this a little bit and then we'll stop, because then we can kind of get into other stuff. But I happened upon there's this individual named Brent Weinstein, and he made the news because of kind of more political reasons. He was a professor at Evergreen College, and he I guess I'll get into some of the juicy details, but not too much, because that's not really what's important to us here today. But he made his 15 minutes of fame, or whatever you want to call it, by kind of refusing to leave campus when some of the student groups and even the president's office, apparently, or whatever, of the school said, hey, there's this whole absence day or something like that, where all the people of color leave the school, and everybody else gets to see what it's like to not have them in the community for a day, and it was based on some play. And so, it was sort of a poignant, kind of very poetic way of trying to say, people of color matter, and they turned it around. They did an inversion, and they were like, hey, wait a minute, let's have the white people not be at campus, so that, I don't know why they did it, to be honest with you. That's not important to this podcast today. But, Brent Weinstein objected. And that, of course, in today's world of, media outrage and being appalled, that's something that just blew up. And before you know it, he was on Fox News and CNN and all that kind of stuff, being interviewed by the bigwigs in the media. And so from there, he kind of got caught up with some of these other people today who are, kind of in a similar situation for similar reasons. So obviously a very famous person today who's kind of in this same boat is like Jordan Peterson, and, some of these other people who in today's political landscape are, things they say don't jive, with the extreme left or the extreme right or whatever. And out of this is poured this new kind of, I don't know if you call it a movement or whatever, but the intellectual dark web and all that kind of stuff. So Brett's kind of part of that. So now that he's part of this thing, I think, he's probably doing things because he doesn't have papers to grade. Because he and his wife decided to not, they resigned from their posts, and they both were evolutionary biologists at the school there. Anyway, so he goes on the talk circuit, but now he's got a little YouTube page, and he's got a website, and he monitors debates and does things like that, and has his ideas out there. And so he, for YouTube, he makes these little videos with obviously some kind of tech savvy friend, and he puts out, whatever it is he wants to talk about, right? That's the whole point. So one of the things he wanted to talk about was this 4-part test, he called it, of adaptation. And essentially the idea was that, you're going to have these 4 parts, these 4 criteria, and if, a feature of an organism or whatever that you're interested in meets these criteria, then damn it, it's an adaptation. So it was one of those kind of things. But the whole way into that for himself was all of this spandrels talk. And so he decided that, after discussing it with his cohort when he was in grad school or whatever, a lot of them took it seriously, this critique of adaptationism, the critique being that people are too quick to come up with a story, an adaptive story for some feature of an organism. And, and then others were like, I'm just going to ignore it. And he thought, no, we need a way to actually reverse this trend so that we can always have a way to neutralize this Spandrels argument, which we'll get into in a second. And so anyway, that's all the motivation. So I was talking to Harland and I was like, God damn it. Like I kind of think that he's sort of, he's kind of like exhibit Z, like we've gone through all the letters of the alphabet. We still have Z. Here comes this guy, 30 plus years later, still doing the thing that I think Gould and Lewontin are saying don't do, and they have all these big reasons. So it's kind of frustrating because it's like, well, what are you doing? Are you just exhibiting the very thing that they say don't do? It just seems interesting. And so therefore it makes me want to listen more. And I'm like, well, wait, what is this? And so that's kind of how we get here. And so I'm going to stop for a second, take a breath, and let Harlan ask probably a very relevant question that I have totally just missed, but we'll keep this thing going.
Well, one of the things that I was wondering about is if you have an opinion on this. You were saying there's not very much up on YouTube about this right now. It's not something that's commonly brought up in general intellectual culture, though it may be slightly more popular in the evolutionary biology circles. I don't know. But would an explanation for its absence be closer to because everybody accepted it? The argument got put out there, it established itself, and now we don't need to talk about it because everybody knows that adaptationism is faulty and we need to abandon it. Or is it more like the Gould-Lewontin position has been abandoned, sufficiently refuted, and now nobody buys it? Apparently, Weinstein is a staunch adaptationist.
Yeah, I would say it's vague. But
do you know anything about? Is there a survey data? What's the going position?
I don't have an answer to that question. Partly because, in a way, like again, I don't really think about this one in particular too often, and unfortunately, I don't have very many evolutionary biology colleagues, and so I'm not like, hitting the rounds at the, getting a cup of coffee and have you heard the latest, coming up to me, someone from behind, like I don't get that as much. So it's, in some ways I'm just doing this more or less. I have been doing it on my own for quite a long time, even when I was in an academic setting, it seems like. So there's that, but like, so I'm not exactly sure if it's been fully accepted or not. I think that the basic thrust of what Gould and Lewontin were saying was taken to heart, or whatever it was noted. And I think people are more careful perhaps than they have been. But again, I'm kind of, the things that I'm interested are not little studies about birds. You know what I mean? So I think in a way at least with Gould and Lewontin being a population geneticist and Gould being a paleontologist, I kind of think that these two guys were kind of on the outside of these things. So they were kind of coming in from the outside and like, kind of thinking they were above it all or something and being like, that's not the way you do it. And that's kind of, that again is the pattern with Stephen Jay Gould. As wonderful as I love, the ideas that he came up with and just his willing to go in and just be like, yeah, and just start a fight, and really get things going. And I think it's, hard to say he didn't. You do kind of wonder, like, if he had taken a little bit different tact sometimes, this wouldn't be talked about as much, I suppose, because clearly he riled people up. I mean, this is a guy who said at one point, only a year later, that he thought that the modern synthesis, and I'm taking this a little out of context, but this is how it was read or interpreted initially anyway, was like the modern synthesis was effectively dead. He just came out and said something along those lines. I am taking it out of the context, but basically the hubbub rose from something like that. And so he did a lot of things to piss people off. And, and Lewontin, I always got the sense that, both these two guys actually, were both, I think, at one time really like they were scientists. They did a lot of science, a lot of data collection, and did a lot of math and the modeling and the you know the comparing the data with the models and all that kind of stuff. By this time, I don't know if they kind of seem to be more just philosophers at this point, So in some ways, maybe you could say, well, hey, they were coming in from the outside, but maybe you could say they were kind of coming in from the outside from a more, a wider scope, philosopher of science, historian of science type perspective. And this is kind of how they assessed the, the bird feeder studiers or whatever. And so that's me being a little dismissive, but it's not my interest. I can see where people get really into it, but anyway. So
yeah, those Harvard professor outsiders always stirring things up.
That's cool. Yeah, that's great.
Right, I get the impression from reading various other critics that Gould had a tendency to have, well, I mean, and he's watching people charge the mound and argue with the umpire all day, right?
Yeah.
Baseball being one of his big things.
Oh yeah.
So he's kind of that sort, right? He's going to get tossed. He gets in your face and he tells you,
Yep.
It's not enough to say, in my considered opinion, some adaptationists are a little bit too far on that side of the spectrum, and I wish they would come towards the center a bit.
Yeah.
No, it's the modern synthesis is dead.
Right, exactly. Right. And he definitely, I don't know if this plays a part in any of it at all, but he's there. He is a New Yorker, so I mean, so the sort of more confrontational style of kind of just being up front and forward and not beating around the bush. Maybe that was part of it too. Maybe he really hurt some, Midwestern sensibilities. Not Chicagoans, of course, but you know what I'm saying. I have no idea. It's he definitely was one of those kinds of people who rubbed them the wrong way. But
I think it's, well, do you have something to finish?
No.
I think we should get into the idea, and then maybe circle back around to the personalities later.
Yeah,
but
because it's kind of gossipy.
Let's talk about what it is they're saying in this paper. Just what is wrong in their view with the general orientation of breaking an organism up into, what did you call it, discrete atomistic traits, and then analyzing those traits as being the result of some sort of unintelligently designed process of optimization that we call natural selection. If that's a fair restatement of what adaptationism is doing, at least the way they characterize it, what do they say is wrong with that?
Well, first I want to set it up with their their metaphor. I think the first thing is it's not obviously looking for adaptation and all that. It's looking at it from a different perspective entirely. So count them down as believers in adaptation and believers in the power of natural selection, and that it being a primary mode upon which most evolutionary change occurs. They wanted to point out this idea of spandrels, which at the time what they talked about was there's this structure in the St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice that has a particular style of architecture where you have like 4 different arches, and then you put a dome on top of it, and the base of the dome is a circle, and the space between the dome and, say, where 2 arches come together produces this sort of like tapering triangle shape. And of course they fill that in with, I don't know if they used drywall back then, but they fill it in with something. And these tapering triangles are just, as they were saying, just a byproduct of the actual overall structure that is put together. So once you have these, tapering triangle faces, because they were always putting their their pictures and their mosaics and everything all over the walls and the ceilings of these churches, the way that these tapering triangles looked, it almost looks as if the intention was to have these beautiful kind of ornate triangular type shapes with the way that they made use of them with these saints, and then the rivers that apparently are being represented at the bottom taper point, and as if they're flowing through these sort of biblical rivers flowing through the church and all that kind of stuff. Their suggestion was, again, that it's just a byproduct, and that they think the problem is that many evolutionary biologists are just looking at, say, something attractive like those spandrels, which are also called pendentives, and we'll get to that in a sec, but are looking at that and saying, well, in order to have the spandrels, there must be this amazing ornate structure that is built around them, and so the adaptationists are starting from the spandrel and moving out, and they're saying, no, there's a structure, and a byproduct is the spandrel, and that is sort of then worked upon from there by, say, natural selection or something. But the spandrel itself is not the result of natural selection. It's just a space that just happens to be there. Maybe the arches and the dome were part of natural selection, but there might be features of organisms that just are there. And so how can we be sure or satisfied that we're onto something when we're doing our science regarding these kinds of these kinds of features that we might be saying are adapted to their environment? And their worry was that if they looked deep, a lot of the things they found were just these kind of stories that were told. It's kind of like the last episode with John Searle in the Chinese room. It's just sort of like, hey, I came up with this idea. That's good enough. Let's move on. And that was the critique in large part, I think, that they really kind of launched the rest of the paper off of, was that there were these stories, more or less, as they called it, just so stories. And they used the Dr. Pangloss story about, noses are, there, just for the glasses, so that you can wear spectacles, those kinds of types of things. So anyway, that was sort of the kickoff point for the whole paper and the idea. They used other examples, including like Aztec sacrifice ceremonies and stuff with respect to the eating of the sacrificed individuals. And, it turns out, one of the explanations that some used was that, okay, well, during rough times, they had to, the Aztecs turned to cannibalism. They had these great ceremonies, and they, once they killed somebody, they all needed protein. And so they, would have these big sacrifices. And that was the kind of the reasoning for why sacrifices were such that, people would even eat the sacrificed individuals. But it turns out upon, further, research, that it looks like actually just the elites ate some. And I'm guessing, I don't know if they had alcohol, but you can imagine a party where people are drunk and they're like, pushing each other into like having a nibble of the leg, and that seems kind of like a wasteful thing. Why would a society, actually be looking to turn to human protein if really, what it looks like from the the data or evidence that's been collected later is actually just, it's just more ceremony upon ceremony or whatever. So they used a bunch of these different examples, metaphors, whatever, to try and illustrate that sometimes things aren't exactly what they appear to be, and that we should just be careful. I think through all this time and me now sitting here talking to you, that's kind of how I think in the end we, what they were ultimately saying. There are embellishments, of course, but
Yeah, let me give a try at explaining it in my words and see if I've got it. That the general point about the spandrels is we go out in the field and we start making observations. We gather data. Then we go home, we go back to the lab, wherever we do this. Scientists have armchairs too, right? And we theorize about why the world is the way that we observed it. We seek a causal etiology of the data. So in this case, you go to the church, you see this spandrel, and it's got this beautiful painting in it, whatever. One might theorize from that data, that tapering triangle is the way it is because they needed a place to put that iconography. We needed that saint symbolizing that river, and the spandrel is there to house the art. An alternative explanation might be that it doesn't have a purpose. It's an accident. That tapering triangle is there because what really mattered is the dome and the arches, for whatever purposes those are for. And the triangle is a complete mistake. After the spandrel came to be, it can be exapted, right, if I'm using that term correctly, to be a place to house a work of art, but that's not why it's there. That's not a part of the causal history of the triangle. First triangle, then art, versus that there was something about the icon that needed a space, and we brought the spandrel into being for that. Is that somewhat the difference?
Yeah, I think so.
So they get frustrated with these adaptationists who run around gathering data and then analyzing all of it. I don't know, that might be a straw man caricature of Gould and Lewontin's to say that that there are these things called pan-adaptationists. I don't know. But they say that there are people whom they want to critique that interpret every piece of biological data as something that can be atomized as an individual trait, and that trait is for doing what we now think it's doing, interfacing with the environment in a way that's conducive to survival and reproduction. And they would like people to slow down, right? And say, but there's all sorts of other evolutionary mechanisms from the whatever they are. You can rattle them off better than I can, but like drift or whatever the other choices are, that don't be so swift and confident to interpret everything as an adaptation of a trait for a purpose by natural selection.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the long approach, the long approach, the more nuanced definition of the adaptationist program, they said, was, this program regards natural selection as so powerful and the constraints upon it so few that direct production of adaptation through its operation becomes the primary cause of nearly all organic form, function, and behavior. So I think what they were in particular in this paper wanting to kind of drag up a little bit more, or a lot more in Gould's case probably, was the constraints bit. These developmental constraints. It just happens to be that I don't know. He backed off from constraints a few years later, so like but at this point in time in the paper, that was something he was trying to say. And I think for him, the imagery of the arches and the dome resting on top of them was, that structure was so constraining upon, all the other shit, like the spandrels included, or pendentives. I kind of want to just quickly go through the pendentives bit. Do you mind, so that we can just start calling them either or, with at least some with at least at some point us mentioning pendentives in a way where they're defined or whatever, or at least just giving them some context.
Sure.
All right, pendentives are actually, apparently that's the what Gould and Lewontin were calling spandrels. Um, the more close name for them, close name, but that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is pendentive, which I guess is a type of spandrel. Um, a space related to arches that is formed when other things ride over the top of the arch. Um, so it doesn't have to be a dome, for instance. It could be like a flat ceiling or something like that, I suppose. You could still get some kind of a triangular shape as the golden arches come together. So I think that's sort of the idea. Apparently, I think for Dan Dennett, he really took that to task to an extent in his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, but then that was later taken to task by, not really to task, but it was definitely addressed quite heavily by a guy who was an actual architect who does research and has all these, had all these NSF grants, named Robert Mark. And which kind of, he was like, yeah, the name's wrong, but the idea that these things would have been chosen over others is not correct. He's like, this is pre-scientific days when people were using things, and they wanted, they would learn, probably, the craftsmen would learn a certain trade and they would stick to it, because it worked. They weren't out there kind of like, which ones? Apparently that's what he was remarking upon. So that's sort of the little bit of history there. Dennett, if you want, our zero audience of zero, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, plenty in there to read about. It's well over 400 pages, I think. So,
it's over 500.
Yeah.
So what's the reason he's bringing this up? I think it all comes from this line that Gould and Lewontin write early on, and that I picked up on it too, because I trained myself to always have the little bell go off when you hear absolutes.
Yeah.
But they say spandrels are a necessary architectural byproduct. And Dennett also picked up on that, and he was asking them to look a little closer. Oh, really? Is it really necessary? Because, and then the reason that Gould is bringing this up, I think, is the whole, I don't know how to pronounce it, the bow plan idea, that there's some level of description of organisms, and I don't know the details, but perhaps they would even claim that there's some thing in the DNA that is more fundamental or something, but that's the kind of the analogy between the architectural constraint and then a body plan constraint, that there might be some fact about a given individual organism's phenotype that necessitated the possession of some other physiological feature. I want to avoid trait because they're criticizing trait.
Yeah.
So then the way that Dennett was bringing up, the whole pedantic point about, well, they're not, you are misusing the terms spandrel, and it's not really a spandrel, but it's a pendentive, and that doesn't really matter. But the part that Dennett said that I liked was to view spandrels as design problems, not features. So yes, when you want to put a dome on arches, now you've got something to deal with. But let's not go from that to, well, it is necessary that there will be a tapering triangular space, because there's all sorts of different ways that we could deal with that affordance or whatever, I thought that point made sense. So then to go back to the organismal side of the analogy, yeah, you got a body plan. It's not very likely that a horse is going to fly, given that it weighs 2,000 pounds or whatever they weigh. But does that necessitate something? I don't know. I don't like necessary claims.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned the horse. Because the one question I think that arises, and I'm not exactly sure how this applies to, Dennett's point. Because when you have the words necessary and constraint, that sounds very strong, right? And yeah, I mean, how do I put this? I feel like this is again maybe what we were talking about with respect to Gould, maybe, where he pokes the monkey expecting to get the angel and is surprised when he gets the monkey, that's sort of his maneuver, and he's shocked that everyone's so mad at him now or whatever. But still, yeah, I think that the necessary stuff is, is just it's very strong language or whatever, and considering that they believe that, like that they're like, yes, it's necessary and all that kind of stuff. I still don't quite sure. I'm not sure if that ends or ruins or hurts their overall argument anyway, because in any case, here you've got Gould trying to tell it, and Lewontin trying to tell adaptationists to be more open-minded. And then you've got Dennett trying to tell them to be more open-minded about telling other people to be, a more open-minded or whatever. It still leaves the adaptationist, whoever they are, Brent Weinstein, it still leaves them not being nearly as open-minded as if you take those two stages, and just go out and be like, hey, there's other things. And then there's other things within those other things, which is essentially what I think that just happened with the Gould, Lewontin, and then the Dennett, stuff. So, yeah, that's kind of, yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I still think that there is an argument here, and that from my interpretations of them, I lean toward Dennett winning this part of the argument. That if, or to the extent, that Gould and Lewontin need it to be necessary or even very tight constraint caused by the architectural or body plan features, Dennett is saying, even given your own example, as soon as you realize that there are multiplicity of solutions to that design problem of how to fill in the empty space between your dome and arch, that the very spandrels / pendentives of San Marco, Dennett thinks, are great examples of adaptations. Quote, chosen from a set of equipossible alternatives for largely aesthetic reasons. They were designed to have the shape that they have precisely in order to provide surfaces for the display of the Christian iconography. So he's even saying that Gould's own example, his prime case of a non-adaptation, Dennett sees that as an adaptation. It's not necessary. There's a bunch of ways you could have done it, and you did it this way because that's the way that's best suited to your environment.
So how deep? I mean, is Dennett talking about both the architectural example and the cultural milieu of building, cathedrals back in the day, and evolutionary problems? Or is he just trying to say, even if we're not talking about biology, let's talk about the architecture. You got that wrong, or whatever. Is that which is it? Like, is it all, or is it just one? Is it?
In this passage that we're now looking at, he's talking about what you had as your first choice, the architecture and the cultural extension. But in the chapter, obviously, he makes it about the biology most of the time.
Right. Yeah, because I think that was the point that I thought that Robert Mark was trying to say to Dennett, was that pendentives became the element of choice. I'm quoting here. Pendentives became the element of choice in the 6th century AD to provide support to large domes over arches springing from 4 piers. Since pre-scientific builders relied heavily on proven approaches in their designs, it is unlikely that the designer of St. Mark's would have considered other systems. Like, he wouldn't have been like, but we all love those pendentives because we can paint our paintings. It was, sure don't want this dome to fall on everybody's head. I know how to do this. So I think if we're going to corner the market on that, then I think that's, so now you've got Gould saying something, Dennett saying something to Gould, and now you got this guy Mark saying something to Dennett. And I think that if we're going to talk about, which I think ultimately is the thing that we're trying to get at, which is like the biological, the evolutionary biology part, I don't know. Like, I mean, I would say that, well, maybe it isn't what Dennett thinks. And so moving on from all of that, is that, though, what Dennett is saying, the case in biological systems? And I think that's where the actual debate now lies, because that's who Gould and Lewontin were trying to hammer away at, using these metaphors and then going to actual examples in their paper. And I don't know, I mean, it's been a while since I've read the Dennett thing. Does he attack their examples? He's like, and then your biological examples too. Is that, can you like, is there that in there? Or, sorry, I'm just like, I'm like pawing in the dark.
What biological examples are they using? I don't even remember that.
Well, that's another issue then that I have, is that, well, why don't we remember the biological example? Like, we get caught up in this metaphor, and now we're up here critiquing the metaphor, and somehow that's supposed to have consequences for the biological stuff. And it's like, well, wait a minute, we kind of need to go back to some of the things that they said. The basic overall, like, movements that they made through their paper were, they start out with these metaphors, then they get to some of the nit and gritty, bird experiments and whatnot. and their basic, like, the hand waving that happens by, those pesky adaptationists. And then they talk about sort of the styles of argument that are going on. And then finally they go into the big one was just telling stories, the Dr. Pangloss, kind of thing where, all this is manifestation of the rightness of things, since if there is a volcano at Lisbon, it could not be anywhere else, for it is impossible for things not to be where they are, because everything is for the best, or whatever. They goes through that, and then finally they start moving into like saying, and even different cultures of scientists seem to also have a different take on these. So they were talking with the organismal side, the sort of what they were talking about, like what's going on in continental Europe. And then, of course, you've got the Brits and the Americans, with which Gould and Lewontin, fairly or not, called, sort of this atomization with optimization of, via selection on parts and stuff, the adaptationist program. And, as I recall also, Russia has had its own history, which actually, if I think to do it, can do it right, that Russian history with this stuff, I think, has a huge impact on why people like Gould and Dennett would have issues with each other, which is in another wrinkle here. But they also talked about, they included Darwin, and they were like, and even this guy wasn't, wasn't, talking about just one mode, and that this is all that matters and all that kind of stuff. So that was sort of the thing that I think at the end, if you were around as an evolutionary biologist in 1979, and you've read that whole paper, you might go, "Whoa, crap!" I'm not saying that years and years later, with all the work and talk that's been going on about it, we don't have other more fuller, nuanced ways to talk about each of these moves. But I do think that there's like, well, what about the biological examples that they provide, and is there something there that reflects what it is they were saying about the metaphors? But anyway, I'll just sort of stop there for a second.
Well, I don't know. Do you have one of those handy? Or if not, when I talk for a minute, you can go find one.
Yeah, you should talk for a minute.
Well, this is why you and I are doing this, because we come at things from a different place, from a different orientation most of the time, I think. Because I prefer to talk about things in the abstract from this level of, yeah, that's fine, let's talk about the spandrels. That I don't need to talk about birds, because it's all the same thing if you just abstract up far enough. And you have this orientation of, yeah, maybe he's wrong about the spandrels, but let's go look at something closer to the fundament and see if down there's a point that makes sense. So yeah, we'll try to do that, I guess. Oh, I remember one of them. He had the bluebirds, but I don't remember the point of it. They took the stuffed bluebirds towards the nests and counted how many times the males and females showed aggressive behavior.
Yeah, that one was it was about the aggressive behavior of males and I guess females. But there was an initial study that tried to see sort of pre-post egg laying of a mating pair. They put this one bluebird model male out, this one particular guy. This one particular guy, this is so sad. I'm like, why don't I have his name? It doesn't matter. Anyway, they put that out, and they just, recorded the behavior of the male before eggs were laid, and then 2 times after. And it was like every 10 weeks or something like that. So not a huge sample size, number one. And so what they found, what this guy, reported was that the first, seeing the, at first seeing the actual, model, the male was quite aggressive. And maybe even kind of aggressive towards the female as well. But I can't remember exactly how that one goes. But then for the
they got pissed off at the new guy for showing up and trying to cuckold them, and then they got pissed at their wife too for like, what are you doing screwing around on me with this dud?
Right, exactly. Which I think is funny as hell. But so there was that. And then, so then the other 2 times it was like, well, I got my baby and my babies, so I've cooled off or whatever it is. And so anyway, let's see if I can actually, find it.
Oh, I've got it right here, and I can,
yeah.
Here's what the point of this one was, because then I was wondering, I remember the bluebirds, but why were they doing this? Mm-hmm. So Gould says, we would not object so strenuously to the adaptationist program if its invocation in any particular case could lead in principle to its rejection for want of evidence. In other words, adaptationism is unfalsifiable. They are claiming, I think, and that bothers them. It annoys them. They talk a lot about the Just So stories as being plausibility based, and that is considered enough. This person that they're critiquing the bluebird study of, Barish.
Right, Barish is how
they quote him as saying, Barish, the results are consistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. Aggression toward an intruding male would clearly be advantageous early in the breeding season when the nests are normally defended, so that they just... Gould is saying you guys stop too soon and too early and get too satisfied.
Right.
You witnessed a behavior. The male is more aggressive before egg laying and less aggressive after the eggs are laid. And you go sit in your armchair and you say, oh, well, that makes evolutionary sense because what the male is interested in is passing on its genes. And once the eggs are already in the nest, it's highly likely that his genes are in those eggs, so he doesn't need to worry as much about philandering female bluebirds. That makes that accords with evolutionary theory. It's a plausible story. Publish. Receive awards, done, end of story. And Gould is like, wait a minute. Right. That's not enough for science, right?
Right. And so then they talk about how some other group, Morton et al. Or whatever, tried to repeat the study, and they did it with a different species in the genus or whatever. But their conclusion was, well, we hope to confirm that Barash's conclusions represent a widespread evolutionary reality, at least within the genus Cialia. Unfortunately, we were unable to do so. And they found no, which I love when people come up with things like anti-cuckoldry. They found no anti-cuckoldry behavior. Males never approached their females aggressively after testing the model at any nesting stage. Instead, females often approached the male model, in any case attacked female models more than males attacked male models. This violent response resulted in the near destruction of the female model, blah, blah, blah. And they said, yet instead of calling Barash's selected story into question, they merely devised their own to render both results in the adaptationist mode. Perhaps they conjecture replacement females are scarce in their species and abundant in Barash's, since Barash's males can replace a potentially unfaithful female, blah, blah, blah. They keep going. And for myself...
But the punchline just is, what good is a theory that cannot fail in a careful study? So that's what they're getting at, right? This is just kind of a Popperian falsificationist. What you're doing shouldn't count as science because you can always tweak your story to salvage an adaptive trait.
I think that what they're saying is... maybe it was Popperian. I don't know. I don't know if they would say that this isn't science. Maybe they would add qualifiers. I don't know. This is okay science. It could be better or something. But I do think what they're attempting to do here, as in within much of the paper, is to say, they've got their metaphor, which I think is a fairly clear metaphor, at least, when you read through it a couple times, you go, yeah. It's not something that's difficult, although, who knows, by this episode standard, it's, not difficult to convey to another person. And then, from there, they then kind of leave open some space. Like, hey, so now we've got some options. Besides just adaptation, because some things might arise that, have no particular purpose. They just are accidental, blah, blah, blah. Then I think they kind of go through, it's not systematic, but they kind of go through kind of saying, and you don't even have your acts together either, or something like that. I think it's a way to kind of, because the field of evolutionary biology, 1979, was so full of, successful work, right? With the modern synthesis, obviously Darwin was, still always will always be, I guess, a big deal in evolutionary biology for, I suppose, obvious reasons to those who study evolution and maybe those who don't. But they're kind of wanting to say, this is a lot more pomp and circumstance nowadays than it's made out to be, and we need to maybe continue to grow the field by looking at other areas. I think maybe I'm being too charitable at the end there, but I kind of think at the end that's sort of what ended up happening, you know. Um, and so yeah, I don't know if that response helps find some middle ground between the two of us on that, but
Well, there's the two Goulds, it seems, right? And Dennett talks about this, and I read it when I see the paper. The one being the radical revolutionary,
yep.
who would say something like, because of this, an entire centuries-long successful program has been defeated. And the other one who says things like, Darwin regarded selection as the most important of evolutionary mechanisms, as do we.
Yeah.
The one that's saying, no, we're not that far. We agree with you. We just think you guys are taking it a little bit too far, and we'd like you to pay more attention than you do now to other evolutionary mechanisms, and we would like you to be less self-satisfied with your just so stories. And both of those things are totally fine to me. I like that part.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that what I suspect or have often wondered was whether or not that's why they went so big and bold. Was because like, hey, I want you guys to pay attention to this. We, like yourselves, have devoted our careers and our lives to, and all our investment to this particular, discipline, and we want it not to be. We want it to reflect what it is that are all our hopes and aims for it. At the same time, when people approach each other and disagree, often we don't keep in the back of our minds that, remember the ultimate goal. Like we just all of a sudden when we're face to face or when we're, back to back typewriters, typing at each other or whatever, the hostility can often rise up or whatever. And we can talk about the people more later, I imagine, as well, because I think that Dennett and Gould, I don't have any major speculations. I just wonder if Gould was, because there's a lot on Gould out there. I don't think there's nearly as much on Dennett as a person. Maybe there's a lot on Gould because of who he was as a person. I don't know. But I could see, Dennett being pissed off about something with respect to Gould on an almost personal level, but who knows? They did know each other, so and they were just down the T from one another, I suppose you could say. So yeah.
All right, well, let's get concrete or something. You can probably come up with a good example. What is the panda's thumb or the dolphin's five-fingered hand or whatever a good example is of something. When I go out in the field and I find an animal and I'm curious about some feature of its physiognomy, is that a word? What do you, in light of this argument or your own thoughts, how do I figure out if that feature is the result of optimizing engineering style natural selection?
Well, I have a 4-part test. Sorry. Yeah, well, that's the thing.
and this is a place we can talk about Weinstein's test as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for me, it comes down to, whatever experiment you would do would be specific to your situation. I don't think there's like a catch-all way to just be like, well, you do this and then you do that and you capture this data and it all goes, easy as that. Typically I think, because I've never done an actual adaptation study, but of the ones that I've read, a lot of times there's an attempt to maintain some kind of control, or at least a multiple number of circumstances, or different experimental designs to compare across, and then that hopefully with whatever the predictions are of the model, if that model is, based on, natural selection, given this organism and its environment, we expect, you know, this particular behavior to be exhibited, um, in these conditions, these environmental conditions, and that would be the connection and the adaptation to the environment if they exhibit that behavior. When we're out in the wild, it's much harder because we don't always have control of all the different aspects. But the ones we suspect, maybe if we set them up and then introduce the organism to that, setup, if they exhibit those behaviors, that's at least some correlation that we're on the right track or whatever. That's some sign or whatever that we're good, we're coming along. And then you could compare that to various other traits, or not traits, but different setups, and then the organism in the different setups could exhibit different behaviors. Something along those lines. Is that kind of what you were trying to ask, or am I just...
I'm not entirely following, but I'll take a stab at it and see if I get what you're saying. So, you, I don't know what the word is. I want to say identify, but that seems factive. You describe some feature as being an adaptive trait. You hypothesize or theorize that that is an adaptive trait, and it is for this purpose. Was the test that you were suggesting... subject that organism to various, actualize some counterfactuals, like test that thing out in various different circumstances and see if it uses that trait to accomplish the purpose that you hypothesized was its teleological final cause, and if so, then that's evidence in favor of it being an adaptive trait?
Yeah, I mean, say you say, this is just a, probably an overused example or something like that. But say you got some finches and you got some nut sizes, and the finches have different sizes of their bills, and you want to say, these bills are matched to particular seed sizes or whatever. So this, small bill will be well suited to crack the small nut, and so on and so forth. Up, maybe say you've got 3 different bill sizes: small, medium, and large. And say you've got I don't know, small, medium, and large seeds, and you say, well, you put the small-billed bird in all 3 settings where they have only access to small, medium, and large, and then you also set them up where they have only access to all, where they have access to all 3, or something like that. And so in the small seed setup, the small-billed bird eats the small seed. In the medium-sized one, it kind of works with it a little, and it's like, God damn it, I'm trying to crack this nut. And the big one, it just like starves to death or whatever. But in the one where you've got all 3 seed sizes, it goes always for the small one. So you go, yeah, I think this bill is, it got a good design for this seed. The voraciousness with which it eats those seeds suggests to me that it really likes them. And it also happens to be the kinds of seeds we find in the same place as the birds themselves, and so we think that these bill sizes are evolved for these seed sizes, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's kind of roughly what it is that I'm trying to answer, but I'm not sure if that's the right answer to the question you were asking.
I'm not either. And when you describe that situation, I just want to critique it immediately by saying, well, maybe the bird goes for the wrong size for a different reason. Birds, I'm going to assume, are pretty stupid. And there might be an engineer who can tell us mechanically that bird's beak is better suited to seeds in size range X. But when we immerse them in an environment that has X, Y, and Z sized seeds, the bird typically prefers Y-sized, chooses a Y size over an X size, even though it's mechanically suboptimal for snapping those. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Maybe the bird chooses it because of some other feature. It's a smell, it's color, it's typical height off the ground. I don't know.
Right. So
but that wouldn't mean that the bird's bill was not adapted for X-size seeds. It would just mean the bird made bad choices.
Well, and that's why you would have the last setup, where you got to see what it did with all three at its disposal, right? So you'd have 4 setups. But anyway,
I was attempting to describe that one, that number 4, where it had access to all the different choices, all the options.
Mm-hmm.
But it typically chose a seed size that the engineer tells me is mechanically suboptimal.
Right.
I could imagine a bird doing that, and if it did, I wouldn't want to take that as conclusive evidence that its bill was not the result of adaptive natural selection.
The way you said that last part, I feel like it's coming in, and I'm trying to rearrange the words. Well,
I'm attempting to use the phraseology that the Gould article was using. Isn't that
right?
What they talk about?
Yeah, I think to an extent, yes. But the bird one that they were giving an example of, I don't think that's nearly as... That one sounded like it was just, we checked 3 times, and this is what we found. It matches what we expect from theory. Enough said. Whereas I think with what I was trying to say was that not that I'm like the best experimenter or whatever, but you'd have 4 different setups, and your hypothesis is, and it could be right, it could be wrong. Because you were asking me, I thought that, what's a concrete way to do an adaptive experiment or something like that. You could say, based on theory, I predict that, that this bill or whatever is going to match this particular seed size over some other seed sizes. And, part of the theory is, you got to survive to be able to reproduce, and that's how you pass on, the natural selection, the theory of natural selection, that's how you pass on those particular traits. And so if you have access to those, particular seeds, and you have those types of small beaks, then you survive and you pass it on, and it originates somehow. It spreads throughout some group, especially those that are, succeeding, and then it's somehow maintained, perhaps because the seeds are, still around and the birds are still around, and they find some kind of balance or whatever with their phenotype, matching the environment or whatever. Therefore, we have adaptive evolution. And Gould, maybe you're throwing me around here. I'm like, what do you want me to do? Did I satisfy the question now that you're playing Gould and Lewontin? That's my question to you. Like, what was your question originally?
My question to you is, I don't know what my question was, but my mind is now dawdling to an aside question. What's the difference between a beak and a bill?
I don't fucking know. I just know that they usually call them bills, I think, I don't know. I mean, I honestly, and I don't know how important that is except for the ornithologists. However, I will say that, isn't that the same kind of question when people are like, what is it, an octopus? Octopuses or octopi? It's like, and I think the answer is usually, well, the, cephalopod, researchers call them octopuses. So let's call them octopuses, It's like that Far Side joke that I was telling you about, the Thagomizer, which was the tail of the Stegosaurus, And this one we call the Thagomizer or whatever after, Thag, whatever his last name was, in honor of him. Clearly he got destroyed by one. And then somehow that word Thagomizer gets, because they never had named it in paleontology, the tail of the the spiky tail of, say, the Stegosaurus, then they started calling it a thagomizer or whatever. Anyway, I don't know.
Once more, does life imitate art? The question
Right.
I was trying to ask is the question that Brent Weinstein in the video you mentioned was trying to answer.
Mm.
And we can try like analyzing what we think of his response and then see if we can do better or something.
Uh-huh.
But so I think that Weinstein's question was, all right, well, the way he went through it, he told us anecdote about, well, I was growing up and going through grad school in the 90s or something, and he was distraught that the Gould Lewontin argument was still taken seriously. He thinks it's so bad, and that he's appalled that anyone still even needs to address it. He thinks that it should literally be ignored. So he said, all right, how can I contribute to getting rid of this problem? Well, I need to design a very clear test that we can apply to any trait that may be an example of adaptive evolution, as opposed to what, this list. Do you want to just give the list real quick of other choices?
You mean his 4 parts, his criteria?
No. I can do those. I mean, what are the alternatives? Because some of us from outside evolutionary biology might just conflate it. We just think, no, natural selection, evolution, same thing.
Right.
But then the more sophisticated of you want to say, no. Natural selection is only one mechanism of biological evolution. Here are some others.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the one that people like to say early on is genetic drift. There's other mechanisms that have an impact that are considered, I think they're considered evolutionary, would be even like chromosomal crossing over. Because that's shuffling the deck, and there's a lot of different things that happen there. Developmental plasticity is one of those ones that is often, I think for many, not for all, but for many, is attributed to the origin of quote unquote traits that then get spread and maintained by natural selection. There's clearly like something like mutation is going to be an evolutionary process in with respect to genetics and the genome. Is that enough, or do you want more?
Well, that last one, that's what natural selection is about, right?
No. I mean, natural selection's just about variation.
More or less, quote unquote, random mutation and selective retention based on phenotypic enhancement. Like if it makes you better at living in your local environment, then it'll be retained. But the grist for the natural selection mill are these pseudo-random mutations, or is that wrong?
I think that's been popularized. I don't know if that is fully the idea. I think some would say, replace mutation with developmental plasticity, like changes in development, like, these kinds of phenotypic responses, and that those phenotypic responses have various dimensions. One of those dimensions runs along an axis we call genes, and another one runs along an axis we call proteins, and another one's the RNA, and cell-to-cell interactions and what's going on around with the cells interacting, and some of it's also called developmental noise. And so there's lots of different various ways that these things all interact together. And this is, again, coming back to what Gould and Lewontin were stressing, was the whole organism, the integrated whole or whatever, and that there are all these various things acting together in development, and that you sometimes get changes in development that then produce the variants that then either potentially can become, if it's successful enough or what have you, can become entrained in the population or whatever. But I think they're sort of induced and it can be induced by lots of things, and mutation can have a role in that. But it's not to say that it's just, the calculus that includes just mutations as the grist, for the natural selection mill or whatever. I don't know if that might be overly simplistic.
I'd be surprised if it weren't coming from me. But okay, so if we take the definition of evolution as changes in gene frequencies and populations over time, is that fair?
Well, where I don't want to be stopping you left and right. So let's just, we've had these conversations. What is evolution? Fuck. So let's just keep going.
All right, I won't ask you. I'll just stipulate that that's what we'll mean by evolution for now.
Let's do that.
So then one of the questions is, how can we explain the changes in these frequencies in these populations over time? One of those explanations is basic, fitness enhancing, optimizing, adaptationist natural selection. Mm-hmm. Clearly, I don't know the way that you prefer to verbalize that, but this thing that Gould doesn't like and Weinstein does like. How can we tell when that causal story applies is what I take the purpose of Weinstein's test to be.
Right.
If we think that these four, he has four, factors are present, then we are legitimized in assuming that the trait is an adaptive one and that we can then start telling just so stories about them and analyzing it. And his four classic.
That is so good.
If I remember them. So the first one was complexity, and the second one was economics, that it's expensive, that there's a cost to the organism to exhibit the thing. And the third one, I'm a little bit interested in why this is a third one, but that there's a difference in cost, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that meant between different organisms who both exhibit the trait, or between the same organism but they can do the trait to differing degrees. We can choose to spend more on it or choose to pull back, or both.
Both, maybe.
And then the fourth one is persistence over evolutionary time.
Right.
So he thinks if we identify a trait and it is complex, costly, of a differential amounts, and it persists, that we are allowed to burden shift back to Gould. This is kind of it's a burden shifting technology, right? If my thing meets these, I get to do adaptationism again.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry that it's just a spandrel.
Right. Or something.
And then he used the example, one of his examples was the difference between the greenness of grass and the pink-gray nothingness color of naked mole rats.
Right.
And he's saying that, well, why is the grass green? Because it has this complex pigmentation molecule that it appears plants don't have to have, but they do, or this one does, and it's expensive. They could have used those molecules to do other things, but they chose to make these pigmentations out of them. Different plants are different colors of green. You could be more or less green, and obviously they stay green for a long time. Okay, now that I've done that, we can say that plants or grass being green is adaptive. But we look at the mole rats, and they also have a color, but we don't find that the reason they are the color they are is the result of a pigmentation molecule that is manufactured by the organism. Could be other than it is. Cost, it's just they are whatever the neutral color is. That's the spandrel kind of thing. Well, it's just there because they don't have hair and their skin is this color and their blood is this color or whatever. They don't seem to spend on color. It's just a triangle shape between the dome and the arches.
Right. Well, but of course, then he goes, well, now surely the loss of color is adaptive. He follows right away. So it's like he gets to have it both ways. But yeah,
Yeah, I suppose he would be saying, right, to not expend on color if color is in general irrelevant or of low relevance to your survival would be the adaptive choice.
yeah. So he,
Don't spend your capital on pigmentation.
right. So he talks about the economics of living as, that's kind of, based on the environment. What is the cost that an organism has to pay to live wherever it's living, right? Um, and, to be honest, I mean, that the I don't know if I'm being nitpicky or whatever, but I'm not quite sure what he means by the green pigment is an adaptation. Is it the green pigment or is it the molecule that absorbs the light in photosynthesis that happens to absorb colors other than green more effectively or whatever to be able to do its energy transfers in the process of photosynthesis? And that's the reflection is the green. Like, I mean, is that what he is getting at? Are we all supposed to say, oh, he's implying it's the molecule, which is a complex, the feature of plants and other photosynthesizing organisms? Or is he saying that what is he saying? Like, what is that? Am I just being dumb?
I'm barely less dumb about that than you. So I'm similarly dumb, so I don't know. When a person chooses to use the phrase, a pigmentation molecule, I interpret it as though that is the primary function or the only relevant function that it's doing. It literally is just there to make me green. However, that also sounds to my ignorant mind that is not what plants are doing.
Right.
Right? Why would they just say... It's not like it's camouflage or so. There might be reasons to have a pigment molecule that's purpose is to color you,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
camouflage would be one,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Or sexual selection, it's attractive, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's why plants are green, but he's obviously understands that. So I don't... That leads me to also not really know where he's coming from. Because I don't think it's literally a pigmentation molecule, but I don't think that he doesn't know that.
Right. Well, the other thing was,
So I don't know.
I mean, other organisms have, like, as I understand it, and I'm more than willing to be corrected, but, like, say chimpanzees or, animals with thick fur, their skin is not all the same color, right? I mean, it's like there's a relationship between the fur color and the skin color, but not always. It can be it doesn't have to be the same. It doesn't have to be a positive correlation. It can be like a negative correlation or something like that. But that underneath that fur, it can be all these different colors. Why are they investing in a color of the skin to be different than the color of the fur potentially? If a naked mole rat's underground and it doesn't have any need for, because of the light issue, why isn't it also, I mean, how expensive are pigments? Like, it seems to me like that, whatever it is that's going on, it could just be something that's lost, like many things. I mean, many organisms that are, cave dwelling in like really, really dark environments also kind of lose their eyes. They don't need those to see. But why isn't it that those that are just born randomly without eyes? I mean, I don't know exactly what the main, issue is here, but my issues with it were the 4 parts. We should talk about the 4 parts of his
Yeah.
way to get back to adaptationism or whatever. Complexity. Well, what's simple in organisms? So that's another way to kind of just sort of, that's the Popperian, you can't falsify me. I know he's saying all four criteria are important, and then once you've got all four, you can go. But complexity seems like you get points on your SATs for writing your name at the top when it comes to biological systems anyway. So I'm not quite sure what he means by complex. I don't know what you think about that.
Again, when I hear complexity, I just immediately think, oh, well, that's relative. It seems to be interpretable in different manners, and if you choose to describe it in a certain way, it looks more complex, and if you describe it in another way, it's less. It just seems very subjective and relativistic to me. In the video, Weinstein was comparing the biosphere to the rest of the universe and he actually claimed, I think, there is nothing complex outside the biosphere. Right.
Well, he said non-adaptive part, and he said the non-adaptive part of the universe. There's nothing highly complex. There are some curious things. There are some structured things, but complexity is different. And then he goes on to this, second criterion. Economics. I don't know what else is there to say, but I don't know how much I want to say. Like, man, you're giving yourself a criterion for free. I feel like, okay, pass that test, or pass that part. It just seems a little too.
Yeah. Okay. So your point is everything about biology is complex, and my point was closer to complexity without accompanying measurement details is close to meaningless.
Right. But I would say, given the spirit in which I think he's delivering complexity, without defining it, without, providing context and all that, except for maybe later when he's trying to talk about molecules and stuff. My thinking is, well, right there, if he's at least saying molecules are complex, then you could just go up from there. And then I guess everything in biology is, as far as if that's a definition of something complex. If, pigment molecules pass the grade, yeah, sure. There's like adenosine triphosphate, and maybe that's not very complicated compared to like chlorophyll. But still, I think, chlorophyll is not an organism walking around. It's just part of one of the cells, and really it's part of one of the chloroplasts, which is an organelle in the cells, and all that kind of crap.
But to some extent, we might be over analyzing.
Maybe,
but the venue he was presenting it. He might have answers to all these questions and a great account of what complexity is. He still owes it to us, and it just wasn't in that video.
Correct.
Which it wouldn't be. I feel about the second one, I think the same way you feel about the first. To me, costly. Okay, well, everything costs something.
Yeah.
Like everything that the body is doing, of course it has a cost in energy, in material, in time, and it all. So yeah, everything's costly. So how does that help?
Yeah, cost to me, I mean, I like costs because they can be relative within, when you're talking about what are you going to spend, like, let's just use money. What you going to spend your money on, because you have a limited supply of, money to spend or whatever. And so you have to budget, somehow organisms would have some kind of a budget. And so then if you're like someone like Gould or me or whoever, and you think of the entire organism, then, costs might actually have, be detrimental to an organism, certain kinds of costs. That's like the one out of all of them that I actually like because it seems to me anyway that at least he's trying to couch it in almost more quantifiable terms. Like the complexity thing is hard. Variance is okay, but again, you and I are thinking there's some ambiguity there. And then persist over evolutionary time, I mean, is kind of a temporally myopic thing to say in a way, given that what he says earlier, which is when we get to an organism, the race is already over. It's like, well, then that's just a huge assumption you're making, but we'll get to that later. Sorry. He says, take a stupid example. You know, your heart has 4 chambers. It's quite clear that a 4-chambered heart has advantages in terms of efficiency because it isolates the oxygenated blood from that's been depleted. There's no doubt that that's why it evolved. Even if there were humans that occasionally had that variance, like maybe different chambered heart, different number of chambered hearts or something like that, and even if you had the budget to find the genes responsible, and now he's talking about scientists having the budget, you have the genes responsible for the difference you're talking about, an immense investment in research to prove something that's utterly obvious, which is that, you know, keeping the oxygenated blood separate from the depleted blood has efficiency advantages. So to me, what he's trying to, you know, taking his adaptive, you know, kind of disregarding the financial aspects he's talking about, and taking his 4-part, you know, or at least the first 2 criteria, you know, somehow the heart is a complicated thing because it's got to separate the blood and it's got to do it efficiently. The organism can't die, you know, because it's got to separate the blood because of the, you know, the oxygenated blood. It's got to have certain functions in the body, and the, you know, less oxygenated blood has got to, you know, got to be just essentially brought back to be oxygenated by the lungs, etc. You know, so there's that. And then he's starting to talk about the cost of, you know, if you have, you know, fewer, you know, chambers, perhaps, how are you going to make that work? You know, well, you know, is it, you know, if you can say that a 3-chambered or 2-chambered or no chambered heart or whatever it is can be, is viable in an organism, you know, closely related to others, or, you know, we're talking about 2 different kinds of hearts or something like that, that are somewhat closely, have, you know, close related, common ancestry or something like that. Then, and each can survive, then he's saying in the variance thing, I think, that the cost to having chambers versus no chambers, to him means that there's got to be a reason why it's there. It has to provide some kind of advantages to the organism. That was sloppy, but that to me stuck out kind of more than the others because it was just this organ and it was vital, you know, the blood and the heart pumping, and you can have a heart attack and all that kind of shit. And so, you know, you don't want to mess with the heart, you know, because otherwise you just keel over and die. So anyway, I don't know how that confuses you.
What it makes me want to do is bring back one of the aspects of the Gould paper that I liked and wanted to mention. The emphasis on holism.
Yeah.
And the skepticism about traitifying in the first place. Isn't this another way to critique Weinstein for being insufficiently relativistic if he wants to make the point a 4-chambered heart is more expensive than a 1-chamber, you know, one without chambers?
Right.
Wouldn't that entirely depend on other organismal factors about the creature? Maybe for certain bodies, whatever trait sounds, looks, you know, you can tell some story where, oh yeah, that's higher cost, more expensive to do it that way. Well, maybe not for this creature. I don't know if this is making any sense.
Well, you're saying, like, given the context of all the other things that has going on, maybe it works. Maybe having 4 chambers is not as expensive. Is that what you're trying to say?
This is a science fiction fantastic example, but what if that's how some creature does everything? Well, I'm a quad I'm everything I got 4 eyes and 4 feet and 4 chambers in my heart. Whatever. I got 4 hearts. I don't know. That's just how I do stuff. It would be more costly for certain organisms to have a one of, maybe. I don't know.
Right. I think I understand what you're saying is that there's, or maybe I don't, but here's me giving a shot at it. That, the history of the lineage that happens to have 4 of everything, or whatever, is just sort of dictates that that's kind of how it operates. And maybe there's some crazy, to us anyway, salience to the whole dang thing. Like it makes sense. But if you were to pluck away at those 4s a little bit, make it, reduce those or something like that, you might mess up the whole thing. Is that kind of what you're saying? But for other organisms, maybe it wouldn't. Am I wrong?
I think that's probably either right or close.
Can I actually get to...
You're familiar... Yeah,
Let me get to something that
Yeah.
I did like from the Gould thing, which I wonder, to me, I'm not saying this is what Weinstein's doing, but I'm saying that I wonder if this is something that Weinstein would like to do, because it doesn't require... His test doesn't require any more... Like, once he feels he's passed the test... It doesn't require any more attention to some of the details that might mess it up or whatever. And I am not saying that he would behave in this way at all, but it was that Galton quote towards the end of the Gould and Lewontin paper, where Galton, I think Francis Galton was his name, was talking about, entertaining Herbert Spencer, the great sociologist of the 19th and early 20th, early 20th centuries. And Galton was doing something about fingerprints. Do you remember this part?
Nope.
Okay. So he goes, I may mention, and this is, has Herbert Spencer at his lab. He goes, I may mention a characteristic anecdote of Herbert Spencer in connection with something that he was talking about regarding the sort of the ridges, the papillary ridges on the fingertips that make up the prints. Why one person has, whorls and the other one's got loops or whatever. And he goes, Spencer asked me to show him my laboratory and to take his prints, which I did. Then I spoke of the failure to figure out, I'm kind of moving it around, I'll just say it. Then I spoke of the failure to discover the origin of these patterns and how the fingers of the unborn children had been dissected to ascertain their earliest stages and so forth. Spencer remarked that this was beginning in the wrong way, that I ought to consider the purpose of the ridges had to fulfill and to work backwards. Here, he said, it was obvious that the delicate mouths of the sudorific glands required the protection given to them by the ridges on either side of them, and therefrom he elaborated a consistent and ingenious hypothesis at great length. I replied that his arguments were beautiful and deserved to be true. But it happened that the mouths of the ducks did not run in the valleys between the crests, but along the crests of the ridges themselves. And I kind of think that, like, if you can just say, well, fingerprints are complex, and, there's a cost to, why, we have them or whatever. I feel like maybe you can start to move over some of the details that might, make up or might, hinder your ability to then move on to the next one and say, well, some people have fingerprints and some people don't, or some people have whorls and some people have loops, and those with loops are, just as well adapted as those with whorls, but the costs might be different. And all that I'm saying is that, because of these differences in costs, that they must be an adaptation, because why else would you spend on them these, the the costs of having whorls versus loops or something like that. I'm moving around quite a bit on it, but it's just that example to me seems to. I kind of want to say it. I just think there's a laziness, and he talks quite a bit about investment in his own way. This is Weinstein, and I don't know. I can get into the more meta stuff in a little bit, but that to me, it just seems like it's like a complexity and costs. I like costs more than complexity, but it just seems like you can always get tripped up with something like cost because you could say, oh, well, the glands aren't where you said they were, and we're really working out of completely different, structural frameworks or whatever, and we don't know, what to do for you. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that didn't go as well as I had planned.
I sure don't know what to do for you. What do you mean you're going to go to the meta thing? What's the meta?
Oh, I have the meta thing was just that I have a kind of like I'm trying to figure out what the motivation is for this stuff. Like, why would you be frustrated with Gould and Lewontin? Why is it, as Weinstein says, Gould and Lewontin's reasoning, why is that insane? Like, why is it, why would he say what it is that he says about...
Yeah, that was a good one. He said something like, yeah, sure, all of this sounds totally reasonable and conservative. It's actually insane.
Yeah.
That was kind of funny.
And I just think, well, when it comes to like, complexity, that sounds easy. That sounds like, like I said, it's like putting your name at the top of the SATs and getting points for it. And then the cost thing, well, as you mentioned, everything has a cost, but it becomes, I think, and maybe I've not been explaining it very well from my perspective, but costs become easy to compare, right? Complexity is a harder one to compare when you're talking about chlorophyll. I'm now starting to think, well, everything, passes muster, for the most part. All organisms have something complex about them, very complex even, and so again, costs can be compared, and you can kind of have a sense for what's going on, but it's still not like, what is the cost? Just because it's, complex and because there's some sort of, investment in it doesn't mean that it arrived at that point because, it was more costly than another. There are some, things that might just cost a lot. Like in this country, we have to pay a lot more, I think, for worse internet than they do in Europe, and there's nothing I can really do about that. Like, I just have that, and it just seems to me like there's like sometimes costs are just costs, and I'm not exactly sure. And so what I was trying to get at was like, well, what is the motivation for all this? Like, why ultimately do we want to be able to have our adaptationist program the way that, say, Gould and Lewontin colorfully put it, and the way that I think, to an extent anyway, Weinstein seems to be exhibiting that very thing?
I would imagine that Gould and Lewontin would not appreciate Weinstein-style adaptationism. I think he would be exhibiting exactly what they're critiquing, right?
Right, I would say so.
Your point about the internet would be one of these architectural Bauplan type points, right? Because of some structural feature of the world I was born into,
I pay that cost. Like,
it's more expensive. I have to pay that cost. Like, I have no other options.
Well, not no other options.
It's forced move.
That's just my main option. You know what I mean? Like, I get it. Like, I'm not trying to go into the necessity maneuver. Just saying that's like, well, out of all the things that you're going to do in your day, are you going to what are you going to spend your time on? Because there's lots of ways to talk about costs, I guess. But, are you just going to pay it and move on, so that you can get all these other things done? Like, it's that kind of thinking, I think, that maybe Gould and Lewontin, we can at least, that's a positive thing to pull out of it. We can leave the necessity back in 1979. We should, before we move on to motivations and people and stuff, we should continue with the third one, which was the variance one. What was your take on the variation? That seemed ambiguous to the both of us, right? Somewhat.
Yeah, but again, it was probably just the mode of presentation. I'm willing to believe that he has a clear distinction here. It just wasn't made clear to me in that video. To the extent I was able to attempt to interpret it, I wanted to respond the same way to 3 as to 2 and just say, as the general semanticist in me, well, of course, every cost is different. Everything is unique and different. So, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And again, it's just ubiquitous and therefore not a useful feature or test. If everything passes the test, it's not much of a test. And I just think everything has a cost and everyone's cost is different.
So
as a friend of ours sometimes likes to say, it's trivial! Brent, it's trivial!
All right, well then, what about this one? This was part of the Gould and Lewontin paper. And I think what they're talking about in 1979 embodies this third criterion by Brent Weinstein. And it comes in the section called The Partial Typology of Alternatives to the Adaptationist Program. And here they kind of go through a whole bunch of different, ways to think about things. Like there's no adaptation and no selection. Or consider things where there's, no adaptation and no selection on, the particular part at issue. That there's some correlated consequence, though, of selection directed elsewhere. Then they go in and they talk about, the decoupling of selection and adaptation. So selection without adaptation and adaptation without selection. And they're going through these various ways to talk about these. So these would also be other ways to kind of see, hey, with the trait that at hand that I'm talking about, does it match any of these other features? And so, can you come up with a big story about why some sedentary marine organisms like sponges and corals have some of the shapes they do? Or can you be like, this looks like they're adapted without selection, just flow regimes in the ocean or whatever. So there is another aspect. But ultimately, what he was saying with that third criterion was this fourth one, which is adaptation and selection, but no selective basis for differences among adaptations. So, the idea that, some have costs over here and some have costs over there, and that, they're different, and somehow that is an indication, or one of the kind of indications that you have an adaptation. They talk about species of related organisms or subpopulations within a species, and I'm quoting here, often develop different adaptations as solutions to the same problem. When multiple adaptive peaks, they put in quotes, are occupied, we usually have no basis for asserting that one solution is better than another. So yeah, there's costs, but the benefits outweigh, right? And so the solution followed in any spot is a result of history. So the first step, so you've got your fours, your organisms of fours or whatever that you were talking about, that I was trying to say, like you got this history. We do everything in fours around here, that kind of thing. So the first steps went in one direction, though others would have led to adequate prosperity as well. Every naturalist has his favorite illustration, and this guy goes in West Indian, Gould says in the West, because this is his baby, in the West Indian land snail Syrian, for example, populations living on rocky and windy coasts almost always develop white, thick, and relatively squat shells for conventional adaptive reasons. We can identify at least two, blah blah blah. He goes on to talk about various ways, but that seems like that's his third criterion. I think I'm not 100% certain, but I think that matches up well with what I think he's trying to say. And he's saying that's a good example for adaptation. I think they're saying it's a good example of adaptation, but it's not it's not a universal thing, I guess. So organisms have varying directions that they've ended up going in, or not organisms, but lineages or whatever. I don't know. Let's move on to the fourth one because for time, right? Anyway, so the fourth one persists over evolutionary time. I mean, I thought that, in general, because we are all, people who are, as even Gould and Lewontin mentioned, we're all about the adaptation and natural selection. I thought that, it was the winners of history that are remembered or whatever, right? I mean, isn't that persist over evolutionary time? I mean, that just seems like another easy one for him to be able to say. It's not like the ones that are like at near death or I mean, like they died, the variants that didn't work or whatever. So they wouldn't have been adapted. So it just seems like, again, this is more almost, that one almost seems like it's begging the question, but I'm not very good at that kind of talk. Maybe you could clarify for me, but that last one didn't work for me either.
I think I'm interpreting it differently than you. I think what Weinstein's talking about. We've got our creature here before us. We know it's one of the winners because it's alive. Well, no, because we have fossil or whatever. Anyway, let's say we have a living one,
Which is really what he's talking about.
It has this feature, and we're wondering if it's a well-optimized adaptation that's good at doing something. If we look at our evidence of its ancestors and its lineage, if they also had the feature, this is just a argument for or a reason to assume that it's positively functional. Because and I don't know to what extent this is an article of faith versus a well-reasoned axiom, but we assume that if you are carrying around something that you don't need over evolutionary time, you will lose to the conspecific who is similar to you in every way but doesn't have the expensive non-functional appendage. So he talked about those pelycosaurs or whatever, right? Like, what if the big fan on the back doesn't do anything? It's just some mutants have that, and maybe we're in a time of surplus, and people who carry around big useless fans on their back are fine. Like, it doesn't hurt. Yeah, maybe there's a cost, but there's so much. Everybody's rich right now, so I can afford it. The assumption is, over long enough time, those will get weeded out, right? So that the one who's just as good as you, but doesn't have the unnecessary appendage, will probably, over time, lose.
Yeah. I'm not sure I fully...
Is that what you were already saying?
Well, I mean, it just seems like, well, if... I feel like there's an assumption that everything is adapted. There's an assumption that everything is an adaptation. And that, wouldn't it be, though, wouldn't it be the things that persist over time to be adaptations? Would they not, I mean, something that has a cost that isn't necessary, that lasts over evolutionary time, would be fantastic. But I think that, as you're saying, yeah, it gets weeded out over time. So adaptation is in the persists over time, which is a criterion for adaptation. It doesn't, like, wait a minute.
Yeah. I don't think that I see it that way, at least not yet. I think the assumption is just basically no free riders. I don't think they have to be begging the question and assuming that everything that's in the animal is already an adaptation in the first place. So then those adaptations which survive are obviously adaptations, well, because everything was an adaptation. I don't think that's what they need to do. I think they just need to assume that any feature, we remain agnostic as to whether it's an adaptation or not, but any trait, if it doesn't give you more than it costs, will be weeded out by the system. But I'm not yet convinced that that assumption is safe.
But that's
it's reasonable, and I can understand it, and like,
I mean, that to me sounds like that's the natural selection will get rid of it, and those that are found later in 2018 will have the adaptations that allow them to deal without having to spend as much of the cost that the other ones did. So what you see at the end of the race that persists over evolutionary time is something that was adapted, something that was selected. That's, I think, what the idea is. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I guess that's my other problem.
Is the term selection in evolutionary theory bidirectional? Like, is it positive and negative?
Yeah, I think you could say selection, people like to talk about it being a creative force, but also it being a negative force to get rid of things, yeah. Okay. But it's the winners that had the so they were better adapted than the ones who get weeded out, and those are the ones we see today. So, and those are also the ones that may have persisted over time, their particular characteristics. It just all seems, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to put it differently than that. Maybe Zero members will agree with me. It's like selection
trying
is built
to
in.
say, I think that in an organism there can be, I don't know why there can't be a few Andrew Bogut's along with the Steph Currys and Kevin Durant's. Why can it not be the case that you as an organism, as a team, win even though you've got some dead weight? If your other traits are really awesome, couldn't you have something costly and non-adaptive, but it still persists over evolutionary time because in other ways you were good enough?
And you're saying, but about that trait that persists over evolutionary time as a fourth criterion for it being adaptive? Like, that doesn't, I don't know how you get, like, the bana at the end once you've persisted over evolutionary time and it was never an adaptive trait, gives you adaptive traits. You know, like, it's the trait.
I'm also arguing against this as a good factor in a test.
I know, but I just think that it's like, I would say that to me, to talk about a trait persisting over evolutionary time, in order to talk about it being the last piece that gives you, hey, this trait was adaptive, then if it was non-adaptive, how would that be adaptive at the end? How would that be? How would a non-adaptive trait be adaptive? Like, how would that be the final piece? Like, if the trait's not adaptive to begin with, then it shouldn't finally make that last part or something. But all of those traits that didn't make that part, pass muster or whatever, would never reach the end.
That's the adaptationist or Weinsteinian assumption, I
think so. And so that's why I'm asking.
If the trait doesn't pass muster, then it will be gone.
Right. So then what does it matter if it persists over evolutionary time? Isn't that the whole point? Like, don't all those traits persist over evolutionary time because they worked, because they were something that provided a selective advantage to those who bore them? So the trait's complex. It has a certain cost, but compared to other organisms, it's not too bad, and it hangs around for a long time because it's maintained. Well, that doesn't, I mean, that seems like you've embedded adaptation into your criteria to finally get an adaptation to say, yep, that's an adaptive trait.
I'm not seeing your argument that he's begging the question. I don't know how this is embedding adaptation itself inside the test for adaptation.
Well, what is it that you're seeing about persisting over evolutionary time, or maybe all of the criteria?
My critique of persistence over evolutionary time as being either insufficient for or irrelevant to or whatever a trait being adaptive is that it seems to me that non-adaptive traits too could persist over time.
Yeah, and
and that was my example of the, if you're really strong and good in all these other ways, maybe you can afford to have a couple of hangers-on of traits that don't do anything for you and cost you something anyway, but yeah, they still persist.
Maybe I'm being too sequential about it, and that it doesn't really matter. You just line them up together and just, it doesn't matter where you just go to any which one. Maybe you start.
Yeah, obviously it doesn't matter. The order of these things doesn't matter.
Is this trait.
You could say persist first and then do complex third, and the order doesn't matter at all.
So you start out. It persists over evolutionary time. It's got a cost, but that cost, you could do a lot of different things. The way he presented it, though, to me makes some sense. But even if you started out, yeah, okay, no, I get it. Maybe it's not begging the question. Yeah. To me, I was thinking, well, I already said what I was thinking.
I never thought about it as though it had to go in a specific order and it was like building upon each other, but rather they were just distinct questions on or aspects of the test.
I would think the adaptation, though, yeah, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily building on each other either, but yeah. Anyway. Where do we go from here?
Has Gould convinced you not to engage in adaptationist reasoning anymore?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. No,
Nor was that his intent.
Yeah. Well, then the next bit that I guess. Well, I mean, is there anything else about the Weinstein video that you had?
Nope.
Okay, well, the next bit that I was thinking about was, and it had to do with motivations for this kind of a thing. And I guess my thinking was that it just had to, like, he was talking about investment, and I guess that's what kind of made me think about it. He was talking about, like, an immense investment to figure out whether or not the heart, with 4 chambers was, an adaptation or not, and that it's utterly obvious that it is or whatever. And I was thinking, well, maybe it has something to do with the way that, the profession is operating. It's you know, to be able to invest yourself in all of your education, all the effort that goes into really probably starting in your graduate school, um, the early days, just everything that's just involved, like, with the, becoming a graduate assistant or a, you know, um, research assistant or teaching assistant or something along those lines, and having to come up with, some research that you're going to do, depending on, whether it's a master's or a PhD, how original it has to be, you know, there's just so much effort. And then, of course, once you actually get into the the last parts of your education, and maybe you fulfill everything that you're supposed to fulfill, and you end up going into the professional world, you have all of this work leading up to this moment where you're maybe going to get a job, and you're going to figure some things out, and maybe you have your love of the field or the discipline or whatever it is. And it's one of those things that I wonder if it's hard to break once you've got that investment. I think the people call it a sunk cost fallacy or something. Like you're going down, like the question would be like, okay, you're walking to the grocery store to get, some groceries or something like that. Halfway there, you forget your wallet, and you decide, fucking, I'm going to the grocery store anyway, even though I don't have my wallet. Would you do that? And in some ways, I wonder if some of this adaptationist stuff follows along those lines. It was okay with my advisor and all of my colleagues, and and then here comes along, two people who were probably tenured at the time anyway, and so it didn't really matter, and they could sit back potentially on their laurels and start to critique, and not have to do the hard work of getting tenure and publishing or perishing or whatever. And that can be quite aggravating, and I'm guessing that it would be probably nice to be able to just keep doing what it is you trained all those years to do. Imagine you get to the end of that race and they're like, well, let's do, it's got to be something else. You gotta now kind of put it in reverse, and now you got to be able to go, drive really good on the roads and do off-roading and do these other, do all these various other things that that maybe you haven't invested like any time in. And now that you're at the end of this one road, you got to start investing in these other things as well. You got to be not only good at figuring out adaptation, but you got to be good at figuring out non-adaptive stuff, or things that just go in different, directions other than what you're used to. And I was wondering to myself when I was reading at least Weinstein after, or not reading Weinstein, but, watching the Weinstein video after, reading the Gould and Lewontin paper, and just thinking, yeah, I mean, Gould and Lewontin's paper is, it's quite dense. There's quite a bit there for 1979, even though this is 2018 or 2017 that the video comes out. And there's been obviously plenty said in the meantime. But I don't know, that was my thought, was that there's it's kind of like, well, fuck, they want me to do what now? And I wonder how much that motivates this kind of thinking.
Probably too much for me anyway. To me, I'm hearing in that an argument against hustling again, and this is why an advantage dawdlers have. If one of your projects is non-intellectual, such as getting a PhD, if you have all these institutional projects, but then tie your ideas to that, well, the way that I accomplish this non-intellectual goal is through my intellectual means and my intellectual endeavors. If it is proven to me in year 3 of 4 that my idea sucks, like you're saying, sunk cost, I would rather pursue the completion of the non-idea based goal, right? So, well, forget it. I'll abandon my intellectual integrity or whatever it is. I'll follow this idea in order to accomplish these other things that matter to me. The impurity of institutionalized intellectual endeavor.
Yeah.
Maybe that was not at all your intent, but that's what I was hearing.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any place to go with it, to be honest with you. I just, for some reason, thought I should say something. Because I do wonder what motivates this shit, you know, because it's kind of, I mean, it does seem quite difficult to do. And I think one of the things that would have been great is if Gould and Lewontin decided to put out an example of adaptation that they liked, you know, like an adaptive explanation, a study of birds or whatever it was, that they were like, yeah, this is what we're talking about. This to us is really convincing, you know, or this other one too, you know, and instead of just kind of leaving it as a critique for everyone else to figure out. Kind of reminds me of one time in this one, it was like a programming textbook that I had. And it was one of those kind of things that none of us really read because it was super esoteric. But when I was doing my master's, I did go back to it because I wanted to see if there was anything in there that, you know, would be helpful. And I was trying to do a particular kind of numerical scheme for this one model that I had. And the guy takes you all the way up to, like, setting it up, but then, like, doesn't help you at all with pointing you in a direction of, like, well, this is, you know, this is a setup for how to use this type of numerical scheme on, you know, any model. Let's take a look at these models, you know. He just kind of like, you figure it out, punk, you know, kind of has this element. And I just remember even with some of my students, and I was just like, well, how do you execute this thing? You know, I guess I have to figure it out myself, but that's not going to be easy, you know, that's kind of what it seems like here. It's just sort of like a, you know, this is, you know, these are all the problems. And, you know, it's like, well, I guess you guys don't have any solutions either. Like, that's sort of, you know, you're just talking about other things with a wistful, in a wistful way or whatever. As if, wouldn't it be great if we went to ball plans and constraints? But, you know, I don't know. There's a lot of momentum that kind of fizzles in this paper, I think, to an extent. And it, you know, obviously has its greatest, you know, force at the beginning with the examples that it gives regarding, or the metaphors that it gives, but then and it has a number of good examples, and I like that it spreads itself out quite a bit, but then after a while it's like, well, what are we supposed to do here? Like, that's one of my issues with critiques in and of themselves without an actual, like, you know, positive side, because I just, you know, it's like, I'm not making any friends, you know, like, yeah, there is something I was going to talk about.
Go ahead. I've never had a problem with that. And perhaps it's because I'm a frequent polemicist myself, but I think critique does not obligate one to purely a positive program. It can be nice, but I think it's optional, and purely destructive projects have a value of their own, I think.
Yeah, but the words you just used, to me, I would switch out, you know. No one said anything was an obligation, number one. Number two, it's not just an option. It's preferable. Like, you know, it's not just like, easy come, easy go. It's a preferred thing. It's not something that you just, kind of say, well, they just happened to do it or they didn't.
By you, apparently. I'm saying I don't prefer that, and that you balk at the word obligation doesn't mean you're not giving them one. When you say it's preferred, it would be nice if one of the reasons I found this paper wanting was that it didn't X. I mean, that's where obligation comes from.
To you, but to me, that's not where obligation comes from. It's just a suggestion. It's not or it could be a recommendation. It's not a mandate.
Well, what's your positive program? Where does obligation come from? I think we mean something different by obligation, probably.
I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, those were just the thoughts that I had.
Okay, have you reached the end of things that you wanted to talk about?
I think so. I think I'm
regarding this topic.
Yeah, I think so.
On this night.
Uh-huh.
Can always revisit.
Yeah.
I could say the same thing.
Okay.
Which means it's time for awkward goodbyes.
Goodbye, awkwards.
I stopped the recording.
Okay.
Oh man! All right, I'm tired. You didn't sound very thrilled either. What's going on over there?
I'm probably tired too. Like I don't have any energy at the end of the day after dealing with kids, and so.
Yeah.